and welcome. It goes without saying that A Nightmare on Elm Street is a classic entry in the slasher movie genre. The terrifying figure, Freddy Krueger, is an iconic villain and a unique counterpoint to the silent, murderous figures of the equally classic 80s horror superstars, Jason Voorhees, and The Shape, also known as Michael Myers. The fifth installment in the Elm Street series, The Dream Child, was scheduled for release during the summer of 1989. Marvel Comics acquired the rights to the franchise and subsequently launched a monthly magazine to coincide with the upcoming movie. Steve Gerber, a writer with a slightly troubled history with Marvel, submitted a short proposal for the magazine. He outlined the direction he would take and the characters he'd introduce to challenge the Nightmare villain. Of the 3 or 4 proposals submitted, Gerber's was the one chosen to launch the series. After that, Buzz Dixon and Peter David would script the next 3 issues. In the 6th issue, Gerber would return and continue where he left off in the 2nd issue. The first 2 issues contained one story, taking up the entire magazine. The following issues were planned to have a main story and a backup feature. Reportedly, from issue 3 onwards, it would include articles and interviews about various aspects of A Nightmare on Elm Street. In other words, it was a standard black and white magazine from Marvel. 2 issues were published, and scripts and artwork had been completed for issues 3 through 5. Presumably, the 6th issue was well into production. However, after the 2nd issue was released, Marvel abruptly canceled the magazine. By all reports, the 2 issues published sold well to comic book stores. In fact, Elm Street was their best-selling black and white magazine the 2 months it was released. Sales information from newsstands had not yet been received, but it's reasonable to presume they would have been solid numbers. So it's not a title that was losing Marvel money. This sudden cancellation was a confusing decision. That confusion was compounded when Marvel didn't elaborate on exactly why the series was canceled. A spokesperson simply stated it was due to, quote, numerous reasons, unquote. So its sudden baffling cancellation, and the complete silence that followed, is a mystery that has endured for decades. Let's investigate. The 2 published issues make up one complete 80-page story. It involves the 2 characters, Dr. Julianne Quinn and Allison Hayes, both of whom are children of parents involved with the death of Freddy Krueger. As established in the comic and movies, Krueger then returned as a supernatural being and began taking revenge. Quinn moved away and got a medical degree, specializing in the psychology of dreams. She returns to Springwood to treat Hayes, who has been attacked and terrorized in her dreams by Krueger. In the first chapter, we also learn about Krueger's past and his evolution into the cold, darkly sarcastic demon he's become. With Quinn's assistance, Hayes learns to control her dreams and survive Krueger's attacks. Quinn also suspects Hayes is a rare person, known as a dream stalker. With more training, she could become a credible threat to Krueger. Unfortunately, before that training begins, Quinn falls victim to Krueger. Following Quinn's death, Hayes is put into a different treatment program. She is once again stalked by Krueger. However, she has developed enough control to prevent Krueger from finishing her off. The story ends with Hayes being sedated and confined to a secure ward for further evaluation. The ending itself is a bit abrupt and open-ended. It's not exactly a cliffhanger, it's a place for the story to pick up when it's resumed. Overall, it's an introduction to Krueger's ongoing antagonist, Allison Hayes, and the threat she embodies. There isn't a full resolution to the overall story, but there is a resolution to that initial conflict. It might not be satisfying to some, but it's not an incomplete story. The death of Dr. Quinn is one of the less satisfying aspects. It's not the fact that she dies, since it's a pivotal event that slows Hayes' progress and gives her motivation to get revenge. Dramatically, it makes perfect sense. However, the weight of that scene and the shock it represents just isn't there. It should feel tragic, but it feels empty. Otherwise, it's a very solid introduction and setup. The metaphysical scenes that constantly shift due to Krueger's control are well managed, as are the dark, borderline satirical lines from Krueger. Neither element should be surprising to anyone familiar with Gerber's career. These were common staples in his work. Even though Gerber had done horror, he hadn't done this style of horror, which appeared to emphasize elaborate ways for victims to meet their fate. Despite his lack of experience and the more visceral nature of the material, he seemed well suited for the project. Importantly, Gerber had a good idea about why Krueger worked as a character. Quote, "What Freddy thrives upon is the ability to destroy the image of yourself in your dreams. What he really attacks you through is the weakest part of your own self-image. He attacks you not so much through your fears about the world, which are bad enough, but through your fears about yourself and your own inadequacies." Unquote. Other than a few derogatory but character-appropriate phrases directed at female characters, the language is pretty tame. The violence and nightmare scenes are disturbing, but not overly graphic. Krueger's early life is more than a little uncomfortable, but again, more is implied than shown. The artwork by the veterans Rich Buckler and Tony D. Zuniga, with inks by Alfredo Alcala, is well done and suitable. There is a very consistent horror comic vibe, as seen in such magazines as Eerie and Creepy, but there's nothing explicit or gratuitous, and there's no nudity. It's pretty tasteful, considering the subject matter. No boundaries are pushed, and in my opinion, with very little editing, the artwork probably could have passed Comics Code approval. To modernize, there's nothing remotely offensive about it. It certainly contains nothing that would warrant the series being discontinued. The cancellation was entirely based on a few related factors. At the time, special interest groups were highly vocal and equally proactive concerning violence in popular media. Boycotts and outrage abounded. The underlying social concern was morally upright parents couldn't shelter their innocent children from the invasive presence of filth being sold as entertainment. Concurrently, comic books, which had achieved some relevance and recognition by 1989, were also becoming a popular target for scrutiny. According to an issue of Amazing Heroes, published in July of 1989, there were 4 separate critiques of the industry within the space of a few months, all of which had a very similar theme. Comics are violent and sadistic. Your children are in peril of corruption and perversion. This was a brief, impotent reprise of the 1950s panic when Dr. Frederick Wortham wrote the highly biased, factually void critique of comics in Seduction of the Innocent. This anti-comics movement was successful, leading to the medium being completely sanitized for the next few decades. Most looking to repeat this part of history took their lead from an article written by Joe Queenan that was published in the New York Times Magazine on April 30th, 1989. The article in question is exceptionally biased, with salacious, fear-mongering language. It focuses on how publishers are selling adult themes and images to children. Even though it does acknowledge the majority of the comics mentioned are labeled for mature audiences and not intended for children. To be fair, the article isn't factually inaccurate, but the choice of language and the description of characters and scenes are greatly exaggerated to produce shock and outrage. It supports the inaccurate, out-of-touch position that comics are primarily for children and they are being sold morally void trash. So with this conversation circling the drain, and with the possibility that Marvel could become a target of a boycott campaign, the Elm Street magazine was cancelled. Steve Gerber stated, quote, "According to my best information, Marvel cancelled the book in anticipation of pressure from the various anti-violence advocate groups. No direct pressure had actually been applied on Marvel." Unquote. The Marvel editor, Tom Brevoort, echoed a similar sentiment from a different angle. Quote, "Marvel president Jim Galton read the first issue and found it too disturbing to continue. He was a man of conscience and principle and didn't think Marvel should publish material like Nightmare." Unquote. Personally, I find the second sentence a bit suspect. The entire issue would have been available for scrutiny prior to it being sent to the printer. That would be the time when such decisions are made, not afterwards. I would speculate it seems more likely the aforementioned social pressures and possible fallout were brought to Galton's attention, and that was his motivation, rather than having an objection based on principles. Also, if publishing material of that nature was against one's principles, a reasonable person might ask, why did you purchase the license in the first place? Other reactions included Buzz Dixon. When asked about the worst thing anyone said about one of his comics was, quote, "I don't care if we paid for it, we're not publishing it. Martin Goodman in a reference to a Nightmare on Elm Street comic I wrote for Marvel way back in the 1980s. Unquote. While someone at Marvel may have said this to Dixon, it most certainly wasn't Martin Goodman. Goodman sold the company in 1972 and had no connection to Marvel in 1989. Regardless, it does support the notion that Elm Street had become a hot potato that Marvel couldn't throw away fast enough. In an effort to be complete and include all the creators involved, Peter David, who wrote 3 unpublished stories for the magazine, has a blurb on his blog that states, quote, "Peter said these Freddy Krueger horror stories were like nothing else he had ever written. In retrospect, he wasn't happy with them and was somewhat glad they were never published." Unquote. It's somewhat ironic that Marvel didn't want to become a metaphorical Freddy Krueger and then be roasted alive by a group of angry, torch-bearing parents. Whether this anticipated reaction was an actual danger or not will never be known. Notably, that same year, at roughly the same time, DC canceled an issue of Swamp Thing over similar concerns. Issue number 88, written by Rick Veitch, involved the Swamp Thing encountering Jesus Christ. The story was approved, scripted, and partially drawn, before DC changed their minds and asked Veitch for a different script. Just like Marvel, the activity of special interest groups was concerning for DC. Finally, in 1991, Innovation Comics published a 6-issue Elm Street series. This was followed by an adaptation of the 6th movie. Then they published 2 issues of a 3-issue Origin series before the company folded. The 3rd issue has never been seen. It's lost media, as are all the issues produced for the Marvel magazine that were never printed. Your humble narrator could not find any boycotts or objections to these Innovation comics. In the decades since, there have only been a few Elm Street series, some more graphic and explicit than others, none of which have achieved the infamy of the short-lived Marvel magazine. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and all that engagement stuff. If you have the means, please support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to all my current supporters on Patreon and YouTube. This has been a rough year, and your ongoing support and kindness have smoothed over a lot of rough edges. I sincerely cannot thank you enough. Extra special thanks to Eidolon, Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sicken, Francis De La Cruz, Michael DeFonte, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, Ellis Greger, Brian Deaton, Tom Granis, John Gaunt, James Graham, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient.